Hello and welcome to JaimeDeitsch's final presentation for our Dynamics of Tourism class. Today we're going to take you on a bit of a journey. We are going to review literature that has been written about Cuban history and the topic of the emerging tourism industry in Cuba. We will discuss this literature and we will relate it to course topics we have covered in our tourism geography class, and we will draw conclusions based on our findings. So sit back and relax and enjoy this presentation about tourism in Cuba. Cuba is the Caribbean island within closest proximity to the United States of America. It's only 103 miles south of Key West, Florida. Cuba is known for its beautiful beaches, historical attractions, 1950s era cars, unique Spanish colonial architecture, and of course, Cuban cigars. After 56 years of tenuous relations between the United States of America and Cuba, President Barack Obama and Raul Castro came to an agreement January 2015 that Americans can now travel to Cuba if they meet one of 12 tourism regulations. For decades, Cuba relied on their sugar industry in order to keep their economy stable. Tourism was reintroduced in 1990, and American tourism was just recently reintroduced in 2015. Cuba is now dealing with the growing demand of guests that want to visit their beautiful country. So right now, we're going to examine literature pertaining to the past, present, and future government legislation, employment variation, and historical perspectives, all dealing with the growing tourist infrastructure within Cuba. First, let's examine some of the significant events that have happened within Cuba's history. Christopher Columbus first founded Cuba in 1492. When he first saw Cuba, he declared that it was the most beautiful land human eyes had ever seen. Cuba first gained its own independence in 1902, and until 1950, Americans dominated the tourism industry. Between 1953 and 1959, the Cuban Revolution occurred. At this time, Fidel Castro and his brothers isolated America from trade and tourism. Then, Cuba became a socialist state led by a communist party. The Bay of Pigs was a very significant event taking place in 1961. This was an attempt by the U.S. State Department and CIA officials to put Castro out of power. Castro found out about the Bay of Pigs before it occurred, and he ended up capturing 1,200 of the 1,500 invaders. This strike became known as the perfect failure. The closest the world has ever been to nuclear war was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. At this time, Soviet nuclear weapons were found in Cuba. Kennedy and his administration were very upset. In the end, Soviets agreed to remove missiles from Cuba, and in return, the U.S. would avoid Cuban invasion. The radical experiment was an attempt by Cuban leaders to establish economic independence from the Soviets. They thought if they could create a 10 million ton sugar harvest, they would be economically independent. Unfortunately, they were only able to create 7.56 million tons of sugar. Therefore, they needed to rely on the Soviet Union for a model political organization. In April 1980, Fidel Castro decreed,
"Any residents of Cuba wishing to leave had the freedom to relocate out of the country as long as they have had someone to pick them up."
This event became known as the Mariel Boat Lift. President Carter welcomed the immigrants with open hearts and open minds. He then learned some of them had escaped from jails and asylums. By October 1980, the Cuban and U.S. government agreed to end the Mariel Boat Lift. By this time, 125,000 Cuban refugees had relocated to the United States of America. By the end of the 1980s, relations between Cuba and America still remained challenged. The 1990s brings us to the present-day tourism era. During this time, Cuba saw a reintroduction of tourism. The MAC Amendment had been passed, and this restricted trade between the U.S. and Cuba. Regardless of the lack of assistance by Americans, Cuban government made a conscious effort to reintroduce support towards tourism. They invested over $3.5 billion into the tourism industry, and in the early 1990s, rooms available to tourists grew from 12,000 all the way up to 35,000. This boost within the tourism industry created over 198,000 jobs. Mr. Ibrahim Ferradas proposed the 1997 Cuban tourism revolution. He made a goal to attract over 2 million tourists and earn over $2.6 million from tourism by the end of the decade. This goal of $2.6 million was far exceeded, and revenues from tourism grew over 65% by the end of the decade. This rapid growth in tourism forced Cuba to focus on sustaining its beautiful natural resources. Cuba is very famous for its beautiful coral reefs and its gorgeous mangroves. Let's take a closer look.
Life under the sea is better than anything they got up there. Under the sea, under the sea. Darling, it's better down where it's wetter. Take it from me.
Here are the beautiful mangroves. Unsustainable tourism in other destinations has led to the destruction of over 10,000 acres of mangroves. The goal is to keep these areas protected under regimen and placing strict regulations on any organization that spoils the environment. In 1996, legislation introduced the Helms-Burton Act. This restricted U.S. trade with Cuba. And in 1999, the Trade Sanction Reform and Export Enhancement Act was passed. This allowed the United States to supply certain agricultural and medical products to Cuba. After over 50 years of tenuous relations between the United States and Cuba, Americans would finally have access to this beautiful country. The first cruise line to visit Cuba was Fathom Cruise Line, a subsidiary of Carnival Corporation, and they first visited this beautiful country on May 2nd, 2016.
Fathom Travel, Carnival Corporation's small ship line, offering 7-day cruises to 3 cities in Cuba, exploring the culture, cuisine, and historic sites through its people.
10 airlines began supplying commercial flights to Cuba, with the first plane landing August 31st, 2016. Americans being allowed restricted access to Cuba has greatly increased tourism numbers. Preservation efforts of Cuba's fragile ecosystem have been effective since 1992. Over 25% of the Cuban marine habitat is protected, but with an increase in tourism numbers, it is very important that we continue to preserve this fragile ecosystem. January 20th, 2017, Donald Trump took office as President of the United States of America. During his campaign, Trump announced that he intended to terminate any reinitiating of relations with Cuba. Currently, his project to sever relations is stalled. We will now analyze the past, present, and future of tourism within Cuba and discuss how it relates to course topics and try to take an outsider's opinion of how this history is affecting our present day. We did mention that the tourism industry has created nearly 200,000 jobs within Cuba. However, it is important to recognize that the average salary of a Cuban worker is $20 per month. Cuba has an excellent healthcare system, and education up to a doctorate degree is complimentary for its residents. However, with such a huge influx within the tourism industry, prices on fresh fruits and vegetables have skyrocketed, and those Cuban workers making such small salaries do not have access to these fresh fruits and goods. Tourists are motivated to visit Cuba for a variety of different reasons. Grayburn's Dimensions of Tourist Behavior and Versions mention 4 different categories of why people would want to visit a certain destination. For some, it's the environment, lifestyle, formality, or health reasons. Some people are seeking a warmer climate. Some people are escaping from their hectic lifestyle. But for many different reasons, a visit to Cuba is beneficial for many tourists. In order for the growth of tourism to be successful in any destination, 4 prerequisites need to be met. These include the presence of resources, the presence of attractions, infrastructure, and capital investment sources. Cuba already has beautiful natural resources and attractions that make it popular for tourists to visit. The infrastructure is growing very rapidly in order to accommodate the demand of the growing tourist population, and Cuba does have capital investment sources from big corporations such as Carnival Cruise Line and Coca-Cola. One popular reason that people choose to visit a certain destination is because of heritage tourism. Heritage tourism is known as an experience of traveling to places, artifacts, or events that represent history and descendants from their past or present. According to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people have a desire of self-actualization. One opportunity to meet this need would be by choosing a destination that you can personally identify with. This market has spawned an industry of heritage tourism. It is very important that this destination keep a degree of authenticity so people find connection to their loved ones, their history, and where they came from. With heritage tourism and tourism in general growing so rapidly within this country, it is very important that government officials and its citizens efficiently plan and manage the development of this growing tourism industry. As of now, President Raul Castro has made a development plan through 2030. Right now, the plan has not been effective for many of the residents. It is very important that planning become a primary concern from the government in order to ensure that tourism is sustainable for both guests visiting this destination and for the residents of Cuba. After doing significant research regarding the history and culture of Cuba, it is obvious that the majority of English printed research available is written from an American perspective. From a Soviet perspective, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a huge misconception. Soviets believe Americans exaggerated their participation because, for the first time, their country was in potential danger. In 1972, Cuba joined Comecon. This was an organization that created cooperation amongst socialist planned economies. While discussing Cuba and its historical and present-day significance, it's important to keep in mind a plethora of different opinions and historical facts regarding this country. In conclusion, tourism continues to change and expand within Cuba, especially since the introduction of American tourism in 2015. Although the tourism industry has created nearly 200,000 jobs for Cuban citizens, it is important to keep in mind that many of these positions are low-paying and targeted towards unskilled workers. In order to keep Cuba a popular tourist destination for years to come, it is very important that the government, its citizens, and its visitors focus on sustainability in order to keep the environment and the precious historic resources maintained and in pristine condition.
Up on the shore they work all day, out in the sun they slave away, while we devoting full time to floating under the sea.
Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this presentation about Cuban tourism for our Dynamics of Tourism course. This is Jaime Deitsch signing off. Hope to see you soon. Bye for now.